Hi, welcome to week one of Human Resources with City Vision University. I'm here with Angie Kreiner. Angie is a consultant that has worked with over 70 ministries, providing them consulting around human resources. She's the most knowledgeable person I know around nonprofit human resources. And in many ways, she's the person that whenever people didn't take this course, and they made mistakes, she helps them pick up the pieces sometimes. But I think more often what she'll do is she will work with the organizations to avoid the type of mistakes that can happen if you don't get everything in line. So Angie is also a member of the Society of Human Resources. She has a PHR, which I believe human resources, what's the P on that stands for?
Professional.
Professional Human Resources certification, and and she's currently working on her MBA in nonprofit management with City Vision University. But so she knows a lot, and she's going to provide you a lot of practical details. So with that, we're going to jump into the presentation. And Angie, thank you for taking the time to share with us from your expertise. So.
Absolutely.
All right, so if you want to just let me, yeah, so I already gave background. Do you want to just start off with explaining how you view the Ministry of Human Resources?
Sure. I think especially in nonprofit and religious organizations, faith-based organizations, viewing HR as a ministry, which is accurate for that context, is really essential. Too often in the corporate world, HR is viewed more as a policing entity, and it creates adversity. Within HR, within ministry, it gives us a fantastic opportunity for ministry. Um, First of all, employees really are in any organization the most costly and the most valuable resource. And so taking care of employees is essential to the health and well-being of an organization. I really view it as both a responsibility and a privilege. Relationally, HR, when you work with employees, creates the opportunity to kind of shepherd people in the door during their time with us, and even in some healthy separation and departures. So I think that to view it as such is it changes the nature of the relationship in a very positive way. The employee realities is that within ministry organizations, we want to feel like everybody is called. But the reality is that that's not always true. There are people who come to us who want to make a difference, and that's why they're there. There are others who need to make a living, and they want to do so in an environment that they believe to be supportive and aligned and encouraging. And there's not a problem with that. I think that we just have to accept that not everyone will be able to articulate a call. Uh, the other reality with HR is that you are going to spend time in HR issues. Whether or not you are proactive and intentional upfront and you spend time upfront will have a direct correlation for how much you end up spending in the back end. And essentially, it boils down to three things, in my opinion. First is stewardship. We have been entrusted with our employees, and that is a significant entrusting. Secondly, it's protection. We have a responsibility both to the organization, the individuals, the donors, the shareholders, the people we serve. And that is a protective responsibility that comes with intentional strategy, structure, and processes. And third is accountability. Before the Lord, like anything else, when we're entrusted, there's an accountability to one another, again, to shareholders, and especially in faith-based organizations, primarily under the Lord. I love the parable of the talents, and I grew up in a Christian home and sat in church. But the older I became, um, I came to really realize that the parable of the talents isn't about money and tithing first and foremost. I think ultimately for me, and certainly this rang true in HR, it is about how we use what God has gifted us with and the opportunities that He gives us and how we steward those practically. If you look at that parable of the talents in Matthew, ultimately, the one servant was held accountable for burying the one talent that he had. And it's ultimately, he was held accountable for non-use or mismanagement. God doesn't want us to bury who we are. He wants us to be willing to share and to invest and to steward that. So HR done right should reflect that. Protection is that second aspect. And in First Peter, it talks a lot about shepherding those that have been entrusted to us to be a good shepherd. Certainly, that is a very common verbiage that we're used to. CEOs, executive directors have also historically had very much a shepherding or a pastoral role. And I think that that's still true in most C-level leadership. But HR is another one of those aspects where we really kind of work with C-level leadership to find people who can assume entrusted levels of responsibility. And HR, you have to have somebody who is in hiring decisions, management, you know, staff front level, direct management. You've got to have someone who understands the shepherding aspect of protection. Set good boundaries, set good parameters, set good framework so that people are ultimately freed up to do what they need to do within the ministry. And an organization that knows and pursues legal compliances and best ups has the best chance and opportunity to frame out what that structure should look like so that people are free to fulfill their other roles and responsibilities. And that creates protection both for the ministry and for individual employees. HR's role in alignment and integrity. HR sits in a really unique position, and I recognize that in speaking to this class. Not every one of you is in an HR specific role, although you end up doing many HR specific functions, and that's critically important to understand. And so when I talk about the alignment and the integrity, you may not have the purview of the entire organization. You may have departmental responsibility and opportunity. And that's okay, because I think that the alignment and the integrity pursuit is going to have an affect regardless of the full scope of your purview. So for individuals who are responsible for HR or for aspects of it, knowing and keeping at the forefront your organization's values, purpose, ministry, and strategic vision is essential, because within the HR role, all of these things need to fit together. I remember working earlier with an organization, and they were really wanting to move into an environment where it was more inclusive and compassionate and grace oriented, but they still had a practice of literally handing out demerits when people misbehaved. And it was very incongruous to the direction that they were trying to go. And so recognizing and being able to take a look at that and how it all fits together is really critically important. Number 4 says top down, inside out. People look to leadership. They look to the key leaders in an organization or the managers to set the standard. And if leadership doesn't model that, if you don't model what you are responsible for within your department, it will take a hit on the alignment and the integrity. And it should facilitate participation. So hiring people and getting them in and training them and engaging them and soliciting feedback and providing feedback should all be run through a filter of increased participation. 6 flows from that. You're going to have a better understanding of what's needed to equip people that will deepen that engagement if you're able to facilitate the participation. And ultimately doing that and making it an intentional thing creates a trust and credibility that you will need to continue to successfully navigate not only the employee relationship, but to keep the organization, the department on track with what the core values and purpose are.
Great, Angie. Yeah, this is really helpful, seeing those 3 points and just understanding that HR is a ministry. Often, people are like, oh, I have to work with my HR department. They think of, oh, that's where I get my benefits. That's where they make me do paperwork, or that's where people go if they get in trouble, or,
Exactly.
performance reviews. But recognizing that the whole service of HR and the HR function of a manager is a ministry, I think is great. So I'd love to hear more of your perspective on, what is human resources from a Christian perspective.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I think it's critical, and especially in our current society, is that depending on how the organization was formed and what the purpose was when an organization was formed, um, makes a critical difference in the infrastructure that gets set up and in the practical operations. So, most of, I think, many of the students that I'm addressing at this point, many of the organizations that I have historically worked with and continue to work with, are formed and filed as a 501c3 charitable religious organization. Um, the purpose of those 501c3 charitable religious organizations is to advance their faith or religion, educate, advance, encourage, evangelize. There's that, the faith is a core as to what they do. And when that is the case, then that literally is, if you think about building a house, that is your foundation. That absolutely has to set and be the foundation for all other structure that goes on top and goes within. The second part of that from a Christian perspective then is that we need to intentionally and clearly communicate. And I use two words. One is unmissable, that you're a Christian organization, and unapologetic, that you're a Christian organization. And I mean that because if we are clear and intentional in those communications from the get-go and all the way through, people can make their own decisions about whether or not your organization is a right workplace fit for them. People who don't have a clear understanding, and I've had this happen before, I hear it from clients I work with, they'll hire somebody. They think they've done a pretty good job of communicating who they are from a faith perspective. Someone gets hired and then they rapidly find out that they entirely missed communication somewhere, and it's manifested in something like, oh, you guys are serious about that Jesus stuff. Yeah, we're serious about the Jesus stuff. It's kind of the whole why as to why we're here. And so it's really important that we take a look at that, from all aspects, which we'll talk about more in the coming weeks. Throughout our communication, I think it's critical for us to be respectful and to treat everyone with dignity. We'll talk a little bit more about that because one thing that I've heard from people is, gosh, I don't think Jesus would, be so judgmental and require people to sign your statement of faith or to agree to your code of conduct or the qualifications for employment. And to be able to craft a response that is respectful, um, towards them, and to say, from our perspective, the reason why we're really upfront about this is because we believe people need to have an opportunity to understand what the workplace environment is. We know we're not for everybody, but this is true to who we are as an organization. There's a many wonderful, kind-hearted, good people who want to accomplish and can great things. And if we're not the right workplace culture for you, we think that you should know that before you spend hours invested in going to work for us. And often just taking that extra time and crafting a response, maybe personally or by email, but very personal to them, leaves them in a better place rather than feeling like it's judgmental and we are trying to just be difficult, but to say, look, here's who we are. You decide if you fit here. And I think that that's really the right thing to do by the organization and by individuals. And then the other thing, really, from a Christian perspective, is that often, unlike most other HR departments where it doesn't feel like the individual employee matters, in a Christian organization, we always want the individual employee to feel like they matter because they do. Now, don't get me wrong, there's always going to be a balance. An organization, a Christian ministry can't extend so far out to an employee if that extension begins to compromise their ability to do what they are to do. So if it begins to cost them in terms of services provided or quality of services provided to the people we serve, then that may be a little too far extended. And we'll talk about this more in the coming weeks. But individual employees, we always have time and we need to make time to help them understand things that are as technical as, hey, this is how this benefit really works. Have you thought about this? Or let me walk you through how to really use your HSA. Too often we assume people understand things that they don't, and they feel like they should. And so what happens is they're embarrassed to really talk to us. I think HR, from a Christian perspective, we always have to maintain that individual value. And a lot of our decisions aren't just how do we solve this circumstance, but what is in this person's eternal best interest as a child of God? How does that look? And then realistic expectations. For the most part, we are going to be with our employees for a season. And so there is something I think to be mindful about redeeming the time and making all that time count, but also understanding that our paths intersect because of God's larger plan. And so to set realistic expectations, but to understand that sometimes leaving us is not a bad thing. The kingdom of God is so much bigger. And often what that means is that they need to get something from us in a specific season, or maybe they bring something to us in our ministry, and then God's ready for what comes next. And I think that we just need to be more open-handed with a kingdom perspective that is larger than our individual organization.
Yeah, Angie, this is really good advice. And this course is called Nonprofit Human Resources. Probably the largest portion of our students are at Christian nonprofits, and these are really important principles to recognize if you're at a Christian nonprofit. If you're not at a Christian nonprofit, how I'd translate this is the same thing's going to apply for whatever values your nonprofit has. What you're talking about is creating good expectations, good boundaries. And the example I always use for people who go into a Christian nonprofit that does a good job, and it's like you walk into a church and you don't complain that they're preaching at you at a church, because you're at a church, right? So, but if you
Exactly.
walk into a building you don't think you're at a church, and then someone preaches at you, then you're like, quit preaching at me, I did not sign up to be preached at. Right? So, and I think that that's a big part of this. But it's the same type of thing for any nonprofit with your values. You have to be clear so that whenever
Yeah,
people come in, they know what they're signing up for. It's a lot more important, honestly, though, for Christian nonprofits, because there is a lot of misunderstandings that can happen. So, and I
right.
know that a big thing that you've done is you've been on the side whenever, the explosions have happened, and you've picked up some, things that have happened wrong. So you kind of have this list, and I'm sure you have a much longer list of the risk management landmines in HR. But yeah, do you want to cover this slide?
Sure, sure. And that's very true. I most commonly get called when there's an issue because that's when you call HR. Help. Anyway, these are a couple things and I see them often. And I want to say that especially in nonprofit organizations, not just Christian organizations, but most nonprofit organizations, we have a heavier compassion than most other corporations because corporations are so bottom line oriented in non-people ways. And so that as a result is that so often people walk into these landmines with good intention and a heavy dose of emotion or compassion, but it creates just epic problems. So you can have good intention, it doesn't negate a bad course of action. Negligent hiring. I literally have had people say to me, okay, I've put this off as long as I can for monetary reasons. So we need to hire somebody now. And I'm going to hire the next person that walks in the door unless they have three heads. And they did. And, anyway, negligent hiring is no structure. It's basically an emotional response. There's a failure to conduct necessary due diligence and background checks, and it wreaks havoc. Second is negligent supervision, which most of the time equates to basically passive aggressive or none. So it's either kind of a like I said, passive aggressive, where it can be kind of overt. And, when a good employee, let me say this, a good employee asks questions. You don't want to shut that down. It's so critical. But some people aren't comfortable with it. Some people don't have time. Some people don't have answers. And so it often translates to, we do this because that's how we do it. Okay. You just need to do it. Well, for somebody who you're trying to breed engagement, who comes to work for your organization because they have a value buy-in, that's not an acceptable answer. And usually it just spirals from there. Negligent retention. There are problems. Problems have been noted. Problems are evident. Problems are known. Problems aren't addressed, or problems are addressed and it gets down to, if this happens one more time, we're going to need to part ways. And then it happens 9 more times. I wish I was making that up. I'm really not. And at that point, what happens is the environment has literally become toxic because the other people know that that's the case. And the person who has certainly violated the corrective action also knows that no other corrective action is going to happen. So now what you've done is create a workplace environment, even if by default, where unacceptable behavior is permitted to occur. It makes it nearly impossible, and it certainly creates some liability to try to roll that back in without clearing house, which is a really ugly way to go about doing it. Wrongful discharge. And again, that tends to happen when people are very emotional and they handle things from an inequitable perspective. And again, this is an overview, so I'm going to refrain from saying too much because we'll get into this more later. But wrongful discharge, people just, when this goes wrong, most of the time they emotionally respond. They don't think through, they don't verify they have documentation. They haven't thought about covering the third shift that this person won't be there to cover this afternoon. And again, it creates liability and it eviscerates the work environment for the other employees. Harassment and discrimination, man, this is huge. In our country as a whole, there's a number of states now that have mandatory annual or biannual training requirements pertaining to harassment and discrimination. Harassment and discrimination, it falls under federal law, and in many states, it falls under additional state laws. You can't afford not to address this in your handbook and in training and being proactive and listening to employees. And when they bring a concern or a complaint, taking action in accordance with policies. Failure to do any of those things create significant liability for your organization. And many states now also permit individuals to be held legally responsible as well as the organization when there are infractions that fall under harassment and discrimination. Safety is another big thing. OSHA regulates on a federal level and on a state level a safe work environment. And so it's critical to understand for your environment what that means, as well as security of information. The electronic world has created a fantastic amount of ease and access, but the same laws that regulate retention and destruction of employee information also is the same for electronic as hard files. So if you are going to transfer your files or most of your files to an electronic record keeping, you have to ensure that you've secured it accordingly so that it's not commonly accessible, it can't be lost, it can't be inadvertently loaded to the cloud and somebody else can just hack it. There's responsibility around that. And those are all the kind of things that I like to refer to as can burn down the house. We don't want to burn down the house. So
Yeah, and I'm sure you've been called in some of those cases whenever, the house is on fire and you have to help. And, this is the slide that I would say, this is why you need this course. You need to pay attention. I mean, there's more than this. We don't want this course to be entirely fear driven, but there's
right,
a good healthy dose of fear that you don't want the house to burn down, right? Um,
right, right.
so,
And
so
going back to, I'm sorry, really quick, but going
yeah,
back to the foundation of religious hiring and then framing out, These are things that absolutely are part of that critical structural framework so that you can put in all the other stuff. And if you don't know these things, and if someone's not looking out for these things, people, again, good intention, bad course of action, and they free fall into these landmines all the time.
Yeah. Now, the outline of our course kind of goes through the life cycle of an employee. So hiring through, onboarding, supervision, and then, separation. In the next part, you're going to give a very brief overview of the hiring process. We're going to go much more in depth in the following lesson. But if you could just go ahead and give us kind of a quick overview of the hiring
Yep.
process, and like, and we'll go into much more detail later.
Okay. The most important thing is process. Predefine a process that will exist and put some time before you actually need to hire somebody into how that's going to happen. So, posting and advertising, sending out an application to viable candidates and a questionnaire so you have more information by which to screen. How the interview structure is going to go. If you're hiring someone who's entry level or temp or seasonal, then that hiring process is going to involve less interviews than hiring a manager or hiring a vice president. And so you really want to think through that. Um, we can go on to the next one because I'm going to hit most of
Okay.
these in greater detail. When you get down to final applicants, predefine what due diligence looks like. You've got to check references, verify work history. You want to compare your notes, go back through all of the people who've spoken and see what got picked up or if something got missed or you need to verify something. We provide what's called a candidate evaluation form, which we'll take a look at later in the process, Andrew, I think, right? We
Yeah,
make
that's
that?
right. Yep.
Okay. But essentially what it does is it creates a means to provide some immediate feedback following an interview so that you can keep information fresh and objective. And before you, as you go through the process of maybe interviewing 7 or 8 people, because then things begin to get muddied. So that's another form that we'll talk about more later. Finally, then, when you make a decision within the process, you really want to put an offer in writing. Make that offer to an applicant and ensure that with it is all the relevant documents that are required for a person to accept employment with you, which for a Christian organization would include statement of faith, usually code of conduct or lifestyle or qualifications for employment. For all organizations, a job description and potentially an understanding of core values and an adherence to that. And then you conduct background checks, not before.
Great.
All right. The other thing is once you've got them, again, we're going to hit this harder later, but you want to spend time onboarding. This is not like a 3-hour process. You really want to allocate a couple of weeks initially to just getting people familiar with your organization. And in the process of doing that, you need to build an evaluation and feedback, not just for you to give to the employee, but also for the new employee to provide to you. That is the best mechanism to ensure that the communication you wish to get across is actually getting across. And there is such fantastic value to having a new set of eyes in your environment because they will see things that we no longer see. And if we make it a priority to listen to that feedback, then we become better in our own environment. The other thing, number 8, is so critical. If you see red flags during the introductory period, don't ignore it. I really relate this to dating. You know, on a new date with a new person, you're always putting your best foot forward. If someone is kind and considerate and complimentary and attentive, it's often said that's the best they're going to be, right? Because they're putting their best foot forward. They're still auditioning. Um, but if they show up and they're rude and they're mean, you don't ignore that because if someone's going to behave that way initially, it's probably going to get more of that as time goes on. It is so true within employees too. You've got to address stuff you see wrong in an introductory period. And 9, again, is just listen and invest. The more we listen to our new employees, the more we can keep practical notes about how to best invest, how they're motivated, what matters to them, what they need from a practical equipping standpoint. All of those things can best be discovered during the onboarding and introductory period.
Great. Yeah, Angie, that's a really good overview. Now, one of the major assignments for this week for students is to understand what is your organization's hiring process. Now, some of you are going to be at very large organizations that have an extensive formal process. You got to have a form at every level, and you have detailed procedures that you got to follow. Some of you just do the hiring yourself and you kind of do whatever you feel like, you know. So one of the principles is going to be to define a more formal process, and that's what this next example is about. Is it's basically showing here's what a process might look like for an organization. And Angie, is this an organization you actually worked with to
Yes,
generate a process like this? So maybe you could talk through for this organization some of the steps for their process, you know, fairly quickly. So
sure. Um, when there's an open position, as you can see on that first chevron, one of the things that we have provided for a template for you guys to use if you'd like is called a job requisition form. In most nonprofit organizations, you have to get a budget approved, and then for the following year, you have to work from that budget. And again, employees and personnel costs are your largest budget item pretty much most of the time. So the first thing on a job rec form are things like, is this a budgeted position? It fills out all the details associated with, yes, we're going to hire this. Yes, it's been approved. This is when we can hire it. This is our salary range. Yes, it's in the budget. All those technical things so that everybody who is part of the official decision making is on the same page. Anyway, then from there it kind of routes through how they apply, if you're where you're going to post it, how the initial screening looks, not lurks, works and looks. Sorry about that. um, the paperwork that you want to see, and then how it's going to get routed. If you have an HR department, for example, in this case, if they get all of the initial stuff, they tend to be more adept at screening and forwarding on to the hiring manager people who are the closest to what they want versus looking at 300 applicants, then the hiring manager might look at 30. So you just need to decide how that's going to happen. Next one. And then, of course, it walks through the first interview, following that interview, what's going to happen, what decisions are going to get made, and then any additional interviews. And then at the bottom, it talks about if you need more than 2 interviews or if another interview is needed, how's that going to work? And if you don't, who actually has authorization to say, go, make an offer, and here's what it's going to look like. So it just is an effort to kind of put people on the same page and to clean things up as they go and say, this works, this doesn't work. This works for this level, this doesn't. So, all right, same thing. When you call to make an when you call to make a verbal conditional offer of employment, to me that just makes sense rather than putting everything into writing. Usually, what happens is through a verbal offer, you're going to work out a few details. There's a few questions that come up, maybe a little bit back and forth about salary at that point. So I think it's always smart to make a call first and then to follow up the written offer of employment. Um,
and
then
one
once,
Yeah, I was
go
going to say
ahead.
one of your bits of advice, and we'll talk about this more, I think, next week, is that it's conditional to things like, you know, signing, you know, a signature page for, you know, statement of faith sometimes, or qualifications for employment, and also background checks and things along those lines, right?
Yes, and the 2 most critical legal things are that the individual actually has a legal right to work in the US and can provide documentation that that is the case. Otherwise, I don't care how much you love them, you're not hiring them because that's
Right.
going to be a problem. So yes, it's conditioned upon those things that are required legally as well as organizationally. So, and then at that point, once you want to send them that offer after you've already had the verbal, along with your statement of faith and the job description, usually a benefit summary and some other things that are important for a person to make a decision. They come in, they meet with HR, they sign all of those legal documents and other required documentations. And at that point, they authorize you to conduct background investigations. We'll talk about that more next week or the week after, but you cannot conduct drug tests, um, investigations related to criminal backgrounds, anything that basically constitutes a third-party consumer report until you have made a conditional offer of employment. And a lot of people have that mistaken. So once they clear the investigations, then the employee can begin work. In some cases, they start work before some investigations are completed. Some take longer. But if the individual, for whatever reason, doesn't pass those required backgrounds, then HR will notify the manager. It doesn't happen all the time, but it can happen. And at that point, it's just a simple notification of that candidate didn't pan out. We're going to need to go back and hire somebody else. We do not disclose the details of why that person didn't pass the background investigation. That needs to stay confidential, but nonetheless, we need to say that can't hire them. They didn't pass whatever test they didn't pass. So.
Okay, well, Angie, thank you. This has been really helpful. I love your vision of HR as a ministry, and also, realizing that there are a lot of landmines. Hopefully, students going through this realize why HR is really important. And, in this lesson, we just kind of gave an overview of the hiring process. And in future weeks, what we're going to go through is we're going to go in a lot more detail. We're going to give you some helpful forms in that process if your organization doesn't already have them, or if they do have them, you can look at these forms and maybe get ideas to improve yours. So thank you again, Angie. This has been great.
Thank you.